Damian's trembling hands clutch a crumpled piece of paper as he faces his parents in their kitchen. His eyes are wide with fear. I don't know what to do anymore," he whispers. "They said it would stop, but it never does." His hands shake as he extends the paper toward them. His mother, Susan, stands frozen in the doorway, remembering recent strange calls and unexplained absences. The ticking clock fills the silence. Michael takes a step forward, scanning Damian's tear-filled face. What did you just say?" The truth hits them. Their son has been living a nightmare they never saw coming. As realization dawns, they stare at the paper, the confession, and the fear in their son's eyes. Damian whispers, "They won't stop coming after me." If you've ever felt that gut-wrenching fear that something is terribly wrong, you'll understand what happens next. Because what unfolds will leave you questioning everything about trust, safety, and the people we let into our lives. Michael and Susan had everything, or at least that's what everyone thought. On the outside, they were the perfect family. 3 beautiful children, a home that seemed straight out of a magazine, and careers that made everyone envious. But beneath the polished surface, things were far from perfect. Michael was a dedicated doctor. His patients loved him. He was the kind of doctor who stayed late, worked weekends, and sacrificed time with his family to save lives. And Susan, she was a brilliant, ambitious banker, the one everyone turned to for financial advice, the rock that her company relied on. Both of them loved their children with all their hearts, but somewhere in the whirlwind of their busy careers, they lost sight of what truly mattered, each other and their children. Damian, Sarah, and Desmond were supposed to be their everything, but in truth, the children often felt invisible. The house was always filled with the hum of activity, telephones ringing, meetings and appointments, but not the sounds of laughter, the warmth of shared moments, or the connection between parent and child. Damian, the eldest at 12, had always been the responsible one. He was the child who helped his younger siblings with homework, the one who made sure everyone was ready for school, the one who would smile brightly at his parents when they came home late from work, hiding the exhaustion he felt from the burden of being too mature for his age. But something had changed. Over the past few months, Damian had become withdrawn, his once open face replaced with a tense, worried expression that Susan and Michael couldn't quite place. He'd stopped laughing at Sarah's jokes. He'd stopped playing games with Desmond. He seemed lost in his own world, a world that he couldn't or wouldn't share with anyone. Susan noticed the change in her eldest son, but didn't quite understand it. She thought maybe it was just the pressures of school, or maybe he was just going through a phase. She told herself he was fine. After all, he was the strong one, the dependable one. But Sarah and Desmond noticed too. Sarah, at 9, was perceptive in a way her parents didn't always give her credit for. She could see the strain in Damian's eyes, the way he would avoid looking anyone in the eye. She would watch him for hours, as though he were staring at something beyond their walls, lost in thoughts she couldn't reach. Desmond, still so young at 6, often asked, "Why doesn't Damian play anymore, Mommy?" His innocent question stung Susan like a slap in the face. She didn't know how to answer. How could she explain to Desmond that his older brother was sinking into a place she couldn't understand, a place no one could see? Mikhail was no better. His long hours at the hospital, the constant beeping of machines, the patients he had to save, the paperwork he had to fill out, none of it left space for him to really see what was happening to his children. He came home late, exhausted, and when he did see them, it was only in passing. He didn't know how much Damian had changed, didn't notice the subtle shift in Sarah's smile, the way Desmond had started clutching his stuffed toy tighter at night. The family felt distant, despite the physical proximity. They loved each other, yes, but it was more of an unspoken understanding than a deep emotional connection. The kids were well cared for, of course. Meals were prepared, schoolwork was managed, and playdates were scheduled. But there was no emotional presence in the house. No one truly saw the children for who they were becoming, and, perhaps most importantly, no one knew the growing, terrifying reality unfolding in the very space they called home. And that's when Mary entered their lives. Mary was hired to help care for the children, someone who would make sure they were taken care of while Michael and Susan continued to climb the ladders of their demanding careers. At first, Mary seemed like a godsend. She was warm, friendly, and enthusiastic. She had a calming presence that made Susan and Michael feel comfortable leaving their children in her care. But as the days went on, things began to change. Mary's once gentle demeanor started to feel more controlling. She was overly strict with the children, demanding silence during meals, criticizing the smallest of mistakes, and her kindness began to feel more like manipulation. It wasn't that she was cruel, not exactly. It was that her version of care was suffocating. The children, who were already struggling with their own invisible pain, began to feel the weight of her disapproving gaze. Damian, especially, felt it. He was the one who spent hours at home alone with her, helping with chores or silently sitting in the background as she watched over him. Over time, Damian started to change even more. He was no longer the smiling, responsible boy who took care of everything. He grew quiet, distant, and angry. He would snap at Sarah when she tried to make him laugh. He would snap at Desmond when the little boy would try to get him to play. He spent more and more time locked away in his room. And the worst part? He stopped trusting anyone, especially his parents. Susan and Michael could feel the unease, but they couldn't pinpoint the cause. They kept telling themselves it was just the pressures of growing up, of being the eldest, of schoolwork. They pushed the unsettling feeling away. They told themselves everything was fine. They tried to reassure themselves with the fact that the kids were healthy, the house was running smoothly, and everything was in place. But something wasn't right. Damian's behavior continued to worsen, and the breaking point came when Sarah, frightened and confused, gathered the courage to speak up. "Mom, Dad, something's wrong with Mary," she said one evening, her voice barely audible, shaking with fear. "She's mean to us. She makes us do things that don't feel right. I don't know what it is, but I don't like it." The words hung in the air, piercing the silence of the room like a cold gust of wind. Michael and Susan stood frozen, not knowing how to process what Sarah had just said. What was she talking about? Was she overreacting? Was this just another one of the kids' stories that they would brush off? But Sarah wasn't finished. She continued, her voice growing more frantic. "She's been saying stuff to Damian, and he looks scared, Mom. He's not the same anymore." It was at that moment that everything shifted. The perfect life they had built, the lives they thought were untouched by any darkness, began to unravel. They had trusted Mary. They had entrusted her with their children, with their most precious gifts. And in return, she had taken something from them, something they would never be able to get back. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Susan and Michael sat down in the living room, the weight of the world on their shoulders. They had no idea how deep the darkness went, but they knew one thing: something had to change. The day they fired Mary, the house felt hollow. Empty picture frames lined the walls, a reminder of happier times that seemed distant now. Susan's hands trembled as she cleared Mary's belongings from the guest room, while Michael paced the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, desperately calling agencies for a replacement. "We need someone trustworthy," Susan whispered, her voice cracking. "We can't make the same mistake again." That's when they found Jason. He arrived like a breath of fresh air, tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that could disarm anyone. His references were impeccable, his experience extensive. 3 families had sworn by his capabilities, his gentle nature, his way with children. Even Sarah, usually shy around strangers, smiled when he knelt down to her level and asked about her favorite books. "Sometimes the best healing comes from a fresh start," he'd said, his voice warm and reassuring. The parents exchanged relieved glances, believing they'd found their salvation. In those first few weeks, the house transformed. The chaos subsided, replaced by an ordered calm. Damian, who had been so withdrawn after Mary, seemed to emerge from his shell. Jason took special interest in him, mentoring him, spending time helping with his homework. To Susan and Michael, it looked like recovery. But Sarah noticed things they didn't. She saw how Damian's smile would fade when Jason entered a room, how he'd flinch at unexpected touches, how his grades, despite Jason's help, began to slip. Her brother, once captain of the junior soccer team, started skipping practices. His room, usually neat, became a fortress of dirty clothes and unopened books. "Mom," Sarah tried one evening, her voice small. "Damian doesn't play anymore, not even with Desmond." But Susan was on a conference call, and the moment passed. Jason's true nature revealed itself in whispers and shadows, a hand lingering too long on Damian's shoulder, private conversations that left the boy pale and shaking, special projects that required them to be alone. The predator had found his prey and he was patient. Damian's world shrunk to a pinpoint of anxiety. Nightmares plagued his sleep. Faceless figures, dark corners, and silence. Always silence. His once pristine homework became a mess of crossed-out words and tear-stained pages. His teachers noticed, sent concerned emails that got lost in Susan's overflowing inbox. Then came the day everything came crashing down. The house was quiet in that eerie way it gets before a storm. Tense, expectant, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to give. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the living room floor, each shadow seeming to hold secrets of its own. Damian sat in the living room, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His heart raced in his chest, but his body was frozen. He couldn't take the weight of the secret anymore. Jason's gaze, his presence, was suffocating him. He couldn't breathe. Every second spent in the house felt like a moment too long. He had the crumpled paper clutched in his hand. The letter, a confession, his last hope, was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. I don't know what to do anymore," he whispers, his voice barely a breath. "They said it would stop, but it never does." His hands shake uncontrollably as he extends the paper toward them, his fingers cold and stiff. His mother, Susan, stands frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind can't seem to wrap around what she's hearing. The words refuse to sink in. Michael, normally composed, takes a step forward. His eyes scan Damian's tear-filled face, his mind racing, trying to piece together the impossible. His words break the silence, thick with disbelief. What did you just say?" The words linger in the air, as if the very room is holding its breath. The silence is deafening. And then, like the weight of 1,000 crashing waves, the truth hits them. Their son, their flesh and blood, has been living a nightmare they never saw coming. The world seems to slow down, and the silence becomes deafening. Their minds, too clouded with confusion and shock, can't process what's unfolding before them. The paper, the confession, the fear in their son's eyes. The confession hung in the air like shattered glass. Each fragment reflected a different piece of their broken reality. Trust destroyed, childhood stolen, family fractured. Susan's hands shook as she unfolded the crumpled paper, her wedding ring catching the late afternoon light. The words on the page blurred through her tears. "I tried to be strong," Damian whispered, his voice barely audible. "I tried to protect everyone, like I always do." Michael moved to embrace his son, but stopped short, suddenly unsure if touch would help or hurt. His medical training had prepared him for crisis, for trauma, for pain, but not this. Never this. "You're safe now," he managed. the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. "We're here." But here was exactly where they hadn't been. The arrest happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah watched from her bedroom window as police cars pulled up silently, their lights off. She clutched her violin case like a shield. Below, Jason was being led out in handcuffs, that familiar smile now twisted into something ugly and defiant. "Don't look," she told Desmond, pulling him away from the window. But it was too late. They had all seen too much already. Inside, Damian sat rigid on the couch, his soccer trophies gleaming accusingly from the shelf behind him. Each one marked a time when his parents had been too busy to attend his games, when Jason had been there instead, watching, waiting. "I don't want to do this anymore," he said suddenly, standing up. His voice cracked with emotion. "I don't want to pretend everything's okay. I don't want to be the strong one. I don't—" His words dissolved into tears, years of forced maturity crumbling in an instant. That night, after the police had gone and the house had grown quiet, Sarah found her voice. She stood in the kitchen, where her mother was mindlessly wiping the same spot on the counter over and over. "Mom," she said, her voice stronger than anyone expected. "We need you. Not your money. Not your success. You." Desmond appeared beside her, clutching his worn stuffed bear. "No more strangers," he added simply, the wisdom of a child cutting through the adult complications. Susan's hand stilled on the counter. Behind her, Mikkel stood in the doorway, his hospital ID still hanging from his neck like a weight. "I don't know how to fix this," Susan whispered, finally facing her children. "Then learn with us," Sarah replied. Recovery came in moments. Michael reducing his hospital hours, learning to say no to extra shifts, Susan working from home 3 days a week, her laptop closed during dinner, family therapy sessions where silence gradually gave way to truth, Damian's first genuine laugh in months, surprising even himself, Sarah teaching Desmond to play violin, their parents actually listening. But there were hard days too. Damian still flinched at unexpected touches. Some nights, the nightmares came rushing back, leaving him gasping in the dark. But now, when he called out, someone answered. When his door creaked open at 3 a.m., it was his mother bringing tea, or his father sitting quietly beside him until dawn broke. 3 months after Jason's arrest, Damian found his old soccer ball in the garage. It was deflated, covered in dust. As he held it, memories threatened to overwhelm him, both good and bad. "Want to play?" Michael asked from the doorway, his sleeves already rolled up. Damian hesitated, then nodded. "I'm pretty rusty," he warned. "Me too," his father smiled. "We'll learn together." They didn't become a perfect family. Perfect wasn't the goal anymore. Instead, they became real, messy, complicated, but present. They learned to recognize the signs of stress in each other, to speak up before silence became suffocating. 1 year later, Damian stood before a group of other survivors, his family in the back of the room. His hands shook as he unfolded a new piece of paper. Not a confession this time, but a story of hope. "Healing isn't a straight line," he began, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "Sometimes you go backwards, sometimes you stay still, but as long as you're not alone." He looked back at his family, at Sarah's encouraging smile, at Desmond's thumbs up, at his parents' proud tears. You're still moving forward. They had learned the hardest lesson, that sometimes breaking apart is the first step to becoming stronger. If this story touched you, share it with every parent you know. Let's remind each other that our children need us more than anything else. Comment below with your thoughts and tag a parent who needs to hear this message. Sometimes the most important gift we can give our children is our presence. 1. When was the last time you truly saw the people you love most? Not just looked at them, but really saw them? 2. What signals from your children or loved ones might you be missing because you're too busy with other priorities? 3. How do you balance trusting others with your children while still staying vigilant and present? 4. What small steps could you take today to be more emotionally present for your family? 5. If you've experienced trauma, what has helped you move forward while acknowledging that healing isn't linear?